My name is John Arrasjid. I am a principal architect of VMware, and I am also happen to be VCDX #1. So as principal architect, I'm focused on both reference architecture design and working with customers and partners on architecture. It's more than 10 years. That's how long I've been here. I'd say I've probably been doing architecture design for infrastructure for about 20 years. But I'd say probably the core of the real deep dive architecture has been in the last maybe 14 years or so. So although I haven't been formally trained in those, I am very familiar with both Zachman and TOGAF, and a lot of the material that I develop has a basis in those architectures, but because of what we do at VMware and the fact that some of they're frameworks, and so we have to extend them in some way to actually fit what we have. So things like swim lanes, dependencies, those are all things that we factor in. We look at the conceptual models of all the requirements, how do we put that concept together, then develop to the logical design, and then to the physical. We follow that approach pretty much across the board, or at least for the senior level. But if you have been doing architecture design, whether it's a full infrastructure or not, you start learning from other architects as well. So I think it's a combination of some of the classes I've taken on design. They may not be Zachman and TOGAF, but the design methodology, the books that I read, as well as the experience I get by working with other architects as well. Okay. And then of course we have internally, we have our own design classes, and we have the VCDX certification program, which is kind of the foundation that we look at for our top tier architects. And a lot of that, I've actually, through interviews, have actually been able to help on producing some of that material, which also helped me to learn as I was going through creating that material. Well, it's kind of interesting. There is one area, which is ITIL Foundations, and the reason why I think that was valuable is going through that process and understanding what are the key components to make sure that you don't miss out on certain areas was very valuable. And I think that although I may not use all of the ITIL terminology or the exact methodology they have, it's designed to be a framework. And so everything that I do is based around that. The other material that I use are the architecture designs that we build as templates internally to give a starting point. And from that point, a lot of our architects are able to learn what do we need to think about. And as we go forward, one of the things that is going to be critical that we're doing here at VMware is developing architecture design classes specifically around the technology suite and the type of use cases that we have. So the one challenge in many cases with Zachman and TOGAF is you have to pay certain licensing to use certain aspects if you want to use their material and stuff like that. So that could pose some challenges in some cases for some individuals. So I can't, without paying licensing, use TOGAF or Zachman in what I produce for customers. One of the things that I have done is participate in development of the VCDX program certification for the top tier architects, and that stands for VMware Certified Design Expert. We chose not to use architect in the title because of some of the legalese around that. Engineer and architect in some states, you have to pass certain certification tests that are designed more for the other types of architects and other types of engineers, not just the computer ones. I do the VCDX boot camps where I train individuals on what do they need to put into a design that will meet our blueprints for a full architecture. And then I also have put together several training programs related to that. So we actually have some MyLearn training and some other online training related to that. And of course, there's a book coming out next month on our on how do you become a VCDX and what do you need to do to go through the certification process. It's about how do you make sure that design will be successful to meet the business needs, and also how do you make sure that you minimize the risk on that design. And actually also understanding that there is no such thing as a perfect design. There's always that trade-off between the pros and the cons to determine what are the acceptable risks. As an example, I mean, I probably wouldn't plan as much for a hurricane in the California area as I would, if I was in Florida. I mean, these are things related to DR, but that's just one of the examples. There's the technology that you use, but first off, does that technology match the business requirements? Just because a technology is cool, it may be the latest and greatest, it may do great things, is it something that is necessary for the customer based on the requirements, which may include a budget, it may include certain skill sets, it may include certain time frames. And in many cases, when I started my earlier career, when I was doing programming and then system administration, it was always, what is the coolest technology to be able to implement, not just because I think it's cool, but because I think that there's some value to meet current and future business requirements. Most businesses have a budget to address something at the immediate need, whereby, for example, fault tolerance, is a technology we have. Is that something that's necessary for that customer or not? Is certain types of availability important? I mean, I've had some customers come back and say, hey, is 7 nines, can you do 7 nines? I'm like, well, what's your budget? But if I look at the balance of what I have to focus on, the business requirements have to drive everything else. And then the two things that it has to drive in the design is the technologies used and how they're implemented, and how do you run and use those technologies. So if you don't factor in the operational considerations, then you're not going to be able to address a successful deployment. You can have the greatest design in the world on paper, but if it can't be implemented or there's potential risk on it because you haven't factored in all those other things, then it's something that you need to go back to the drawing boards and address those areas. No design is ever going to be perfect, but you just want to strive for perfection and make sure that you meet those business requirements and address and make people aware of what the risks are that may be inherent in certain aspects. The technology, the operations, they go hand in hand. And if you do one without thinking about the other, I think that's where we see the biggest problem with the customers that I've worked with. I don't want to stay blinded by only focusing on my current company's area, because by learning from these other groups and other companies, I can do my job better to make sure that I can meet the requirements and, where appropriate, be able to adapt when I have to use a competing technology or a compatible technology to augment what I've done. And when I talk to people who are getting into architecture, I want to make sure they understand that they need to look at what are the requirements for a project before they make the actual technology decision. And even if they work for a company that sells particular technology, they need to understand what are the capabilities, and if there are missing pieces, what do they do to augment those missing areas. On the operational side, I think it's very important that an architect doesn't just design in an ivory tower. They should interact with system administrators on a regular basis, and they should interact with business owners on a regular basis to actually get more of an input on what is working. If possible, if they do a design, review where that customer is at some point in the future, 6 months or a year later, to see how did the design work, did any issues come up, were there special success stories or around the design, and have they learned, is there a better way to do certain aspects of that design? But I think there are many different schools around computer, and architecture and stuff like that. We have architects in our area that came from a background in housing architecture. We have people that come back with the background of engineering architecture. The key is, can you learn, can you adapt, can you make sure that you're not locked in and sold only on one solution? Figure out what is the right solution for the customer that you're working with. So I think from classes, I think computer science classes can be very beneficial. Some schools teach more on the programming, but most of them, if it's a true computer science school, you learn also about the infrastructure, networking, storage considerations, and things like that. Now, if you're just starting out and you've got your degree, there are different steps you go through, and a lot of people don't go directly into infrastructure design right out of school. And even if they have a master's degree or a PhD, there are some hands-on apprenticeship aspects that provide better value for an architect to be successful. And so that's kind of my background on how did I go through this? I started out doing programming. I did system administration part-time. I found ways to do things maybe a little bit better than they were implemented, made some changes to the architecture. That's how I got some of the groundwork. And most of the core architecture design was doing independent consulting, where I worked with other architects, and then at VMware, where that's been my life for the last 10 years. Right. And so whether a company releases new technology every 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever it is, you have to be able to adapt. And products change that have to work with other products that may not change at the same rate. Right. And so that's why the experience of going through the pain points of system administration and seeing what are the strengths and weaknesses in a design helps that individual when they actually start producing a design. You know, a lot of times I'll get asked, well, why did you cover this in the design? I mean, it doesn't seem relevant to what we're doing. I go, well, this is what you explained. These are some of the requirements. And so there are certain assumptions I have to make. And we've already, you know, we may validate those assumptions through the Q&A or through certain design reviews. And those early stage logical design or conceptual and logical design areas are where we can work out those details and figure out what the best choices are. I look at design being architecture, but design, I'm not sure there's an exact definition around where you would compare the two, but at VMware as an example, we have several certification layers. There's like a VCP layer, then there's a VCAP layer. One level is for architects and one is for designers. Designers being those who are starting out on doing simple architecture design. They may not factor in regulatory compliance, you know, certain security or DR aspects. They may not factor in complex designs. When you start getting into complex designs where you have multiple vendors, multiple products, that's kind of where it starts bumping up to, I guess, what we're calling more of an expert level or an architecture level. But honestly, it probably would be safe to say that design and architecture could be used interchangeably. It's just kind of the way that I have been using it, where design is the first step, but architecture has more of the science behind it and more of the experience behind certain aspects of the design at that level.
Right.
I think when you're going through a design and you're trying to strive for perfection and recognize you have a specific budget, maybe you can't exceed it, right? If you exceed it, then technically it's not a perfect design in the eyes of the business because you're going beyond what their boundaries were. The other thing is you try to factor in risk. Now, although I had mentioned earlier, I don't expect in California to have a hurricane here, and I don't expect to see an earthquake in Florida. Guess what? It is possible for both situations to happen in those areas, but what is the risk? So in a perfect design, you'd factor in all the possible combinations, but you have a limited amount of time to do a design. You don't have forever. You don't have an indefinite, or what do you call it, an unlimited budget. And you may also have constraints around the skill sets of the team that's actually going to be using it. So you have to factor those in when you put it together. So it's definitely different than an artist's perspective on how they create something and how somebody might view that. But here's an example. I participate and have been helping on the VCDX certifications, where we sit and we judge a design and we judge the individual who is going through the design process and explaining the design and things like that. And as an example, you know, designers, you know, when I talk about designers versus architects, where I differentiate is I would say that somebody at the starting point who might be called a design, let's not use the terms, but let's say a starting person in this architectural space may always want to use best practices. But best practices are for a majority of customers, for a majority of situations. Sometimes you have to modify those best practices to something that doesn't appear to be a best practice, but for that particular project and that particular customer, it is the best practice for that situation. And when we go through these VCDX certification panels and we ask questions and we hear the person present, if they say they use it because it's the best practice and that's the only way to use it, we already know that that person isn't at that advanced level yet, because they may not have ever had a mistake that was significant, or they may not have recognized that you sometimes, it's not bending the rules, it's not bending the best practices, it's making sure that the best practices for that customer and that project are used, whether they're already created or you modify an existing one to match the needs and make sure there's no risk or minimal risk.